H.G. Wells is one of the most influential writers that ever lived. There's only one problem. I'm not entirely sure he's a writer. Now, before an angry mob of science fiction enthusiasts arrived at my front door with copies of The Time Machine and War of the Worlds, allow me to explain. Undoubtedly, Wells wrote novels. He wrote some of the famous novels ever written, yet most people think of Wells, when most people think of Wells, they rarely think of his characters. They think of time travel, they think of alien invasions, they think of invisibility, they think of strange scientific experiments and visions of the future. The ideas survived, the concept survived, the man himself survived. And that, perhaps, is why our story begins. Wells liked to describe himself as the owner of a very ordinary brain. Indeed, his biography was called The Memoirs of a Very Ordinary Brain. It is a wonderfully modest claim. Unfortunately, it's also difficult to believe. The young Herbert George Wells was not born into privilege. His father struggled to make a living through a mixture of shopkeeping and professional cricket. His mother worked in domestic services. The family often found themselves balanced, precarious between respectability and poverty, belonging fully to neither world. Opportunities were scarce and disappointment was common. Wells's brothers appeared to find their feet before he did. Illness interrupted his education. Financial difficulties followed a lot of the time through much of his youth, but by any reasonable measure, the odds were not particularly favourable. Wells grew up in that uncomfortable territory between poverty and security that characterised much of Victorian Britain. The family was respectable enough to fear falling down the social ladder, yet never secure enough to stop worrying about it. A failed business, an illness or loss of employment could threaten everything. Wells never entirely forgot that insecurity. Later, when he wrote about wasted talent, social barriers, and educational opportunity, he was not writing as a detached academic. He was writing as someone who had experienced the precariousness of ordinary life firsthand. Yet, Wells possessed one quality that would define the rest of his life. He noticed things. Long before he attempted to invent tomorrow, he spent years carefully observing today. He noticed social divisions, he noticed educational inequalities, he noticed wasted talent and wasted opportunity. He noticed the strange contradictions of Victorian Britain. Now, a nation capable of extraordinary achievement while simultaneously tolerating extraordinary hardship. Most importantly, he noticed that knowledge seemed to offer a route upwards. Education became his academic ladder. Eventually, that led him into the world of science and higher reasoning, most famously under the guidance of Thomas Huxley. Now, Huxley was one of the great scientific communicators of the age, a fierce defender of Charles Darwin's ideas, and a man who believed that observation and evidence mattered more than tradition or assumption. The influence upon Wells was profound. Huxley thought more than science. He taught method. Observe carefully. Question assumptions. Follow evidence wherever it leads, rather than where fashion or tradition would prefer it to go. Whether examining ideas, politics, education, or psychotechnological change, Wells carried that habit throughout his life. In many respects, he remained Huxley's student long before he left the classroom. Throughout his life, Wells remained fascinated by observation. He watched society with the curiosity of a scientist and the imagination of a storyteller. He examined industrialization, class, education, politics, and scientific progress. He was less interested in accepting the world as it was than in asking what it might become. And in many ways, this this was Wells when he was at his best. It really rather annoyed me, to be honest, with looking back upon his memoirs. Now, his famous observation that human history becomes a race between education and catastrophe reveals a man paying close attention to the forces shaping modern civilization. Now, whether one agrees with his conclusion is almost secondary, which puts me at the wayside anyway. The important thing is that Wells was looking. Many people see Wells' preliminary as a novelist. I'm, I'm, I'm not so sure. His ideas found expression through fiction, whether imagining humanity's distant future in the time machine, an overwhelming alien invasion in War of the Worlds, scientific power without moral restraint in the invisible man, and the consequence of experimentation, of genetic manipulation in the island of Doc Moreau. The interesting thing is that for his first 2 or 3 novels, he only referred to his protagonists by his own first name. Wells repeatedly returns to the same question: what happens when knowledge, science, and social change outrun wisdom? Well, yeah, there's the question. Perhaps the clearest evidence lies in what audiences remember. Ask people about the time machine, and most people remember the time machine long before they remember the time traveller. Ask them about the War of the Worlds, they're more likely to recall Martian tripods, Orson Welles' famous broadcast, Jeff Wayne's musical version, or Tom Cruise running through exploding streets from Welles' narrator. The ideas endure. The machinery endures. The concepts endure. The characters often fade into the background. This is not really a criticism, it's an observation. So perhaps that's the fairest place to leave Herbert George Wells for now. We'll look into his reforming activities next time. A remarkably perceptive observer was young Herb.
Remembered not as a messenger, remembered not as a reformer, not as a prophet, not as a hero.
Remembered only as George. Give us a good clicking.
Shakanaka.